Welcome to our fifth episode in our series entitled Church and Illegal Immigration. And in this specific subtopic, or rather sub episode, we are dealing with the subtopic criminal church, proceeds of crime or unlawfulness. Now, that's our focus for this episode. We are still talking about practical implications in as far as the law is concerned when it comes to churches. Now, of course, as I've said in the previous episode, that in these episodes, particularly from episode 4 going forward, whenever I touch on the law, such as in this one, I'm not giving a legal opinion. Yes, I'm a legal practitioner, but this is not a legal opinion. So what I say here ought not to be relied upon solely in deciding specific circumstances, but I should be understood as just doing this as part of educational efforts in as far as the church is concerned, making the church aware of the broad implications of the issue of its relationship to illegal immigrants or illegal foreign nationals, especially those who are attendees or members of the churches. Now, that is the focus for this episode. And I want us to start with just a definition of a few terms. If you are, I'm going to be in this episode focusing primarily on an act that you can find online. The statute, the name of it is Prevention of Organized Crime Act 121 of 1998. That is the act that I'll be focusing on primarily in this episode. Of course, not the entire act, but just two or three provisions there that I think are relevant for purposes of this episode in this series. But I want us to also just touch base a bit briefly on something we did mention as well in the Immigration Act that we touched on in the previous episode. But for starters, let's just look at the definitions under Section 1 of the Prevention of Organized Crime Act, sometimes just simply called the POCA Act or POCA. Under Section 1, that is the definition of the terms being used. When it talks about unlawful activities, it defines it and says it means any conduct which constitutes a crime or contravention or contravenes any law. Now, that is what is meant by unlawful activities. It speaks to a crime or a violation of a statute or the law. So now that helps us to understand that what was discussed in the previous episode under the Immigration Act, where we spoke about various offenses. If you go to Section 49 of the Immigration Act, which we touched on in the previous episode, I'll just remind you of what Section 49, subsection 6 says. It says, anyone failing to comply with one of the duties or obligations set out under Section 42 to 46 of this Act shall be guilty of an offense and liable on conviction to a fine or to imprisonment not exceeding 18 months. Now, part of what that pertains to is what we discussed in the previous episode, where we spoke about the crime of aiding and abetting illegal foreigners. So the violation of that law is also included in the act that we are dealing with in this episode, the POCA Act, because unlawful activity includes crime and violation of the law. So what we touched on in the previous episode is also encompassed or included notionally in terms of unlawful activity as far as the POCA Act is concerned. Now, having said that as well, keeping in mind that under definition of the terms of proceeds and property, the Act also defines what it means by property. It's not just talking about cars and tangible stuff and houses, but it includes as well, if you look at the Section 1 there under property, it says money, movable, immovable, corporeal or incorporeal thing, includes any rights, privileges, claims, securities, and any interest therein, and all proceeds thereof. So the word property, therefore, is broad. It doesn't speak to only physical things, but includes physical things such as money itself, which may not be physical as well, might be in the bank account, but that is money or funds nonetheless. So that's important as well as we try to understand what the implications may be for a church when it comes to the issue of illegal foreigners. Now, This is important, this topic, especially because I want to focus on just two sections of the Prevention of Organized Crime Act. Of course, it talks about money laundering, it talks about gang criminal activities. I won't go into those, which also may have implications as well in terms of at least investigations and suspicions as far as the church may be concerned. But I want to focus particularly on just three sections of this act, the Poker Act. That is Section 5, Section 6, and Section 8. In passing, I'll just mention Section 8 or make reference to it. It talks about penalties for offenses. It says any person convicted of an offense that is contemplated in this chapter under paragraph section 4, 5, 6, which we're going to discuss shortly, shall be liable to a fine not exceeding 100 million rands or to imprisonment for a period not exceeding 30 years. Now, that should tell you the seriousness by which the government takes this crime or these crimes that are listed here, which are under Section 4, money laundering, Section 5, assisting another person to benefit from proceeds of unlawful activities, and Section 6, talking about acquisition, possession, and use of proceeds of unlawful activities. Now, those provisions are very important because if you violate these provisions, the church, if the church does violate and is of course found to be guilty of an offense, may be fined an amount which may be as up to 100 million rand, of course, or to imprisonment for a period not exceeding 30 years. Now, of course, the imprisonment part, you can't take a church into imprisonment, but when it comes to natural persons, because it's not just natural people, physical people, but it's also entities that may be defined as persons. And of course, when it comes to natural persons, it may not be a fee, a fine, but it may be actual imprisonment. But at the very least, the church can be fined as a church, as a collective, as an entity, any amount which may go up to 100 million. And of course, the court would decide as to how much is appropriate for each instance. Now, having given those introductory remarks, I want us to just focus on these two provisions, Section 5 and Section 6, especially Section 6. But let's start with Section 5. I won't touch on Section 4. It might also be affecting the church, but I won't deal with it due to time. I think it's less relevant compared to Section 5 and 6. But you may have scenarios where money laundering is actually an appropriate investigation appropriately is done towards that, the crime is suspected, and of course, the church might be found to be guilty of it. But I think Section 5 and Section 6 will suffice for our purposes. Section 5 talks about the crime of assisting another to benefit from proceeds of unlawful activities. Now, it then explains, it says, any person, which includes the church, who knows or ought reasonably to have known. So it may not be that you know, but you may not know that there's unlawfulness in as far as the activities of the church member or the congregant, in terms of the fact that they are conducting a business, they are employed somewhere unlawfully, and of course that then falls within the purview of unlawful activities because it is money acquired unlawfully in as far as the law of the land is concerned. So the church might not know, but if it ought to reasonably have known because of there being signs of some sort, that to the fact that the church member or the congregant, there's a reasonable suspicion that the church member should have, or actually did have, but didn't act on it, to the fact that the particular member or members are unlawfully employed, gainfully employed, or are conducting business in the country. And the church just turns a blind eye and just says, well, it's tithe and offering. God says you must be faithful in your tithe and offerings. Yes, it might be tithe and offering, but God doesn't just want any proceeds to be given as tithe and offering. He wants us to have clean hands in doing so. And I'll come back to the scriptures shortly on that issue. But the church, because it wants the money, because it wants to build a building, it wants to buy houses, buy lands, or buy vehicles, and pay the pastor or the staff, or pay for some event or project by the church. The church sends a blind eye and just says, "Well, this is holy money. and God is accepting, God requires of this person who is a member ought to return tithe, especially because he or she is a church leader and they ought to be exemplary. So they must return tithe and offerings, only to find that actually this money, tithe and offerings, are proceeds of crime or unlawful activities. Now, it says here, any person who knows or ought to reasonably to have known that another person has obtained the proceeds of unlawful activities and who enters into an agreement, any agreement with anyone or engages in any arrangement or transaction whereby, I'll leave A, let's go to B, the said proceeds of unlawful activities are used to make funds available to the said other person or to acquire property on his or her behalf or to benefit him or her in any other way shall be guilty of an offense. I'll give an example, just one example on this point, where let's say, for example, the church recognize that so and so is employed or is conducting business, but they want to buy a house or they want to buy a vehicle, and the amount that they have, they it's not adequate for the needs that the church recognizes from of the person. Let's just say maybe it's a house. They are somewhat homeless, and their house needs renovation, or they need to be purchased a house for. And they can perhaps, let's say, raise 100,000 rand or 200,000 rands towards a property based on the amount that they have from their employment or from their business. Then the church comes in to say, well, let us top up and buy a house for him. Let's add 500,000, and then he can come with his 100 or 200,000, and we assist the person to benefit from unlawful activities or proceeds of crimes. And now this is an example that where the church might find itself in a bind when it comes to the law and be found to be guilty of this offense, assisting another person to benefit from proceeds of unlawful activities. Now, that's a case where the church reasonably ought to have seen that the person is actually unlawfully employed or unlawfully engaging in business, and therefore whatever proceeds that they bring to the church, in this case, it's for not for the church's benefit as such, it's for their own benefit, but the church is topping up to what they have. Now, that of course can compromise the church, where the church can be found to be guilty of this offense. And of course, that by extension affects the name of the faith, the name of Jesus, because Jesus then can, into some mind, some people who come to know of this violation of the law and the transgressions of the church against the statute, then might find themselves having a tainted image of the name, the precious name, and the holy name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So churches must be aware that whenever they are going to benefit any person in the congregation or among the members of the church by perhaps topping up and adding to whatever income they might have raised for themselves, to buy a car, to buy a house, to buy furniture, and so forth. The church needs to be aware that it can be in a bind, can find itself in violation of the law, such as this specific provision. But I want to spend a bit more time on Section 6, which I think is quite more comprehensive and quite more broad in as far as the church is concerned when it comes to tithe and offerings. Now, in my tradition where I belong in terms of my denomination, once you become a member, part of your vow when you become a member is that you are going to return to the Lord the faithful tithe and the faithful offerings. Of course, tithe based on your income, your earned income, 10% of it. And then, of course, offerings there's no cap. It can be more than 10%, can be less, can be for specific projects and so forth. Now, you are not, in my tradition, disciplined or removed from the faith, from membership, simply based on you not having been faithful in returning tithe. But in my tradition, how the policy works and is framed is such that while you can remain being a member while not returning tithe, you cannot be in a leadership position in the church while you're not returning tithe. Okay, so now that means that a foreign national would then be able to be part of the church while the church doesn't receive any tithe and offerings from the member. It may receive, it may not receive, but there's no mandatory, no offense as far as the policies of the church are concerned when it comes to a member who is a member of the church but not returning any tithe and offerings from their income. But when it comes to a leader, of course, the church requires and expects that you are going to return the tithe and offering, your tithes and offerings, particularly your tithe. So that then brings the foreign national into a purview of individuals who, or rather brings the church into a situation where it is trying to enforce a policy on an individual, a congregant, a church member, of them returning tithe from their income because of their position. Now, it becomes more sensitive when it comes to a leader of the church in that scenario. Now, in some other churches, it might not be the case. It might be that whether you're a leader or not a leader at all, there is no requirement for tithe and offerings. So maybe those churches might be less affected by this, although they may still be affected because typically members, even if there's no tithe requirement, would give offerings and maybe donations towards projects. So that's when the source of funds becomes critical when it comes to the church itself, its name and its property is concerned. Because if the funding is compromised in terms of its nature or its source, in terms of being stained with unlawfulness, then whatever the church benefits from those proceeds, can also compromise the property of the church itself. Now, Section 6 says the title is acquisition, possession, or use of proceeds of unlawful activities. Now, keep in mind, proceeds can include money. So tithe and offerings, which I think I'll focus on, is important here. It may also be a property itself, might be a vehicle that is being donated, maybe even a house is being donated. Those are proceeds, but of unlawful activities, which means that they are acquired through unlawfulness. And in this case, unlawfulness includes unlawfulness in relation to there being no permit for the person who's a foreign national to work in the country, employment, or conducting business. So that is what we're dealing with here in Section 6. It says any person who acquires, uses, or has possession of property. Now, property, remember, it includes money, it includes almost everything, basically. Any person who acquires, now any church who acquires, uses, or has possession of tithe or offerings, and who knows or ought reasonably to have known that it is or forms part of the proceeds of unlawful activities of another person, shall be guilty of an offense. So the church, when it receives tithe or offerings or donations from congregants or members, doesn't matter whether it's a congregant or a member or someone who is not even linked to the church, but somebody random in the community, when they give a donation, give an offering, or whatever they give, but it's property, which is obviously has economic value, is donated or given or returned to the church, and the church receives that money, and the church knows, or maybe doesn't know, but ought to know, or reasonably should know, if it was exercising a reasonable exercise of ability and discretion. It then becomes guilty of the offense of acquisition, possession, or use of proceeds of unlawful activities. This simply means that the church ought not to receive tithe and offerings from people who are not compliant with the law in as far as immigration status is concerned. Now, I know the impact, the implications, financial implications of what I'm saying to you, but in as far as this act is concerned, if the church knows or ought to know that such proceeds that it receives for its own benefit and use, in terms of its mission, its mandate, is stained with unlawfulness, then the church is guilty of an offense. That is when the church becomes a criminal, basically. Of course, now, if it is ever charged, it would have to be tested in court through civil proceedings and or criminal proceedings as to whether it is in violation of the law, and possibly convicted and then fined, or as you said, as it said there in Section 8, up to 100 million rands. And also, of course, where it may be competent, it may also be individuals and not the church, really, that are imprisoned for a period not exceeding 30 years. So I won't go to the specifics now of whether in a church scenario where a church is found guilty, there still may be individuals who are held liable and they are accept in themselves imprisoned or not. I won't go there, but I'm just going to focus on the church and the fact that the church's name is stained and the property of the church itself is also compromised. Why do I say so? I won't go through all the sections that you find in the Act, the same Act, Prevention of Organized Crime, but the same Act talked about a number of types of orders that can be granted against the property of the church. The Act talks about restraint orders, where perhaps the church is restrained from selling or letting property. Um, pending certain procedures of law, confiscation orders where property is confiscated, preservation orders, seizure orders, limitation orders, and worst of all, forfeiture orders where property of the church can be vehicles, it can be the building itself, whatever it belongs to the church. If it is determined that the church has unduly benefited or has benefited unlawfully through proceeds of unlawful activity, such as through tithe and offerings from individuals who do not have legal status in the country, the property of the church becomes exposed to these possibilities should there be an investigation conducted and findings made by a court of law that the church is liable in any of these ways. So it's not just a matter, therefore, of the church's name that we are dealing with when it comes to the issue of church and illegal immigration. Of course, we will still come back to the issue of, we did start off in this series talking about the mission of the church, the gospel, and how the church ought to be ministering to everybody, like the Good Samaritan. And we did see in the previous episode that the church actually has I won't say a loophole, but it's a provision allowing it to act in a humanitarian way towards people who are unlawfully in the country as unlawful or illegal foreigners. The law does allow the church to act in a humanitarian way towards such people or persons. And towards the end of this series as well, we'll come back to those issues about how the church ought to positively assist and contribute towards people, both South Africans and those who are foreign nationals. And mind you, those who may not be in this country who are listening to this episode or this series, I think that similar provisions will probably be found in your countries as well, because the laws of the lands of the various countries tend to take from each other and learn from each other and have similarities, especially where there are international agreements and there's international law involved as well. So it is therefore something critical that the church must know, that your church must know that this issue of unlawful foreigners, who are, as far as Christians are concerned, made in the image of God, they are individuals who are no different from us or from you. I'm also a foreign national to another country. If I go and visit another country, I may be there legally or illegally. But whether I'm there illegally or legally, it doesn't change the fact that I'm made in the image of God. There's a dignity that is recognized in me. In fact, even our own country, South Africa, and as I think many countries would, they do recognize in our country, in our constitution, there is recognized dignity in people who are foreign nationals. They do have constitutional rights which protect them. No one can just harm them because they are foreign nationals, they have no rights. They cannot be harmed. So the law, they are protected to an extent when it comes to our constitution, because they are still human beings. They are still, and as long as you are within this country, there are laws that protect you, but you don't have the same protection that a citizen has or a person who is in the country lawfully or legally. We don't have to go into all those details, but there is protection, but it's limited. And as a Christian, of course, we do have a duty to love and to care for everybody. But while doing so, let us keep in mind that God also requires of us as churches and requires of us as individuals, even foreign nationals, to comply with the law. The church and the foreign national who is in the church or in the country unlawfully, both of them have a duty to comply with the law. As far as God is concerned, you may be excused when there's a conflict between the law and God, particularly on issues of worship. But other than that, there is no excuse that one can give in as far as continuing to remain non-compliant to the law of God. Now, I do know that this is a very sensitive topic when it comes to foreign nationals and their family circumstances. And perhaps I should increase the number of episodes and just add an episode which will deal with the pain and the difficulties that may be faced by foreign nationals in the process of trying to comply with the law. Maybe I should have an episode just on that. But for now, I think the focus is simply on the fact that the church needs to know that the issue of illegal foreigners within its congregation or within its purview is one that might not just implicate God and his name should the church be found guilty, but it may in fact compromise even the property that God has given to us in one way or another. So our stewardship of God's property is also implicated here. And so we need to, therefore, as churches, be wise as serpents, but harmless as doves in our handling of the situation. And I know that there are many churches whose half of the membership, by churches now, I'm not talking about denominations, I'm talking about local churches across denominations. There are local churches across the world, and perhaps I'll just focus on the country, South Africa, maybe even my own province, KwaZulu-Natal, whose membership, half of them perhaps, are mainly foreign nationals, and a significant portion of whom, if not all of them, do not have proper documentation, are undocumented, in the country unlawfully, and they've been giving tithe and offerings faithfully, in as far as church expectation is concerned. But I want to close off in this episode by taking us to the scriptures, the Bible, which talks about the issue of not specific to unlawful activity or the issue of immigration as such, but it is a principle that you find when it comes to the nature of the work that you do in as far as its lawfulness and you giving to God in tithe and offerings. God is not just looking for any tithe and offerings. Um, but God requires you. Maybe let me just read the text first. Maybe let me go to Malachi. Let's go to Malachi before we come to Proverbs. Malachi, if you look at chapter 1 and chapter 2, talks about a number of issues that God raises with his people in the book of Malachi. I didn't plan to go to Malachi, but it just came to my mind now as I was about to read Proverbs. But if you go to Malachi, without going through the whole book, maybe one day we'll do a series on the book of Malachi. But at the very beginning of the book in chapter 1, um, there is an emphasis made if you look at verse 8 and also yes, verse 8. Or maybe let me just go to verse 13. It talks about God is complaining about the fact that the people of Israel, among other things, they don't bring their best to God. So, for example, when it comes to offerings, when let's say you have two sheep, one is lame, the other one is healthy, relatively so, to the other one that is lame or blind. And then there was a practice at the time where people would take the one that is lame or diminished in value, so to speak, and take that and give it to God when it comes to offering. And the fat one, the one that is well off, is retained for themselves. Now, God was complaining about that to say that is unfaithfulness because you can't say you are giving what God wants you to give must be your best. But then, if you look at verse 13, part of that discussion on what you give to God, not just in terms of quality, but also in terms of the nature of its acquisition. Verse 13 says, um, I'll just read the second last part of the verse, the middle part. It says, and you bring the stolen, the lame, and the sick. Now, of course, the lame and the sick, I understand that, but it's also significant that among those that God says, among the types of offering that God complains about is the offering that is stolen, which means that it is not actually yours. So in other words, it's not just about giving money to God. You can't go and steal money, rob a bank, and then come and take that and say you're returning tithes to God and say you've been faithful. Because the point is not about just giving 10% of your income. but the point is about spiritual faithfulness. Now, obviously, when it comes to illegal immigration and immigration laws, there may be no direct interpretation of theft in as far as the conduct of a person who enters a country and gains employment, doesn't steal from anybody, but gains employment and returns a tithe to the Lord. So it's not theft in the normal sense of the term, or normal sense as we commonly understand theft in the normal sense of it. But in the broader sense, actually, there is an unfaithfulness and perhaps even unfairness in as far as the person relying on the resources of this country, whether the effect is felt or not felt by other people, but relying on the resources, the infrastructure, the roads, the everything that might be there. Worse if you fraud documents and you go to hospitals and do all kinds of things. But even if there's no fraud, but you rely on the basic services and people are paying for these services. And those who are paying are the ones who ought to be benefiting from them. But then while you are benefiting from the resources and everything in the country, you're not contributing to it by paying tax as you ought to, or you would have to if you were properly documented. So in that sense, perhaps you can read there some dishonesty and some theft, at least in the broad sense, and some unfairness that an unlawful or an illegal foreigner in a country, any country, might be exercising towards other people. So in a microscopic way, perhaps you might not read theft, but in a macroscopic way, particularly when it comes to when it becomes even felt by a local community and so forth, which I won't go to for now. Maybe we'll touch on that later on, because there will be an episode later on, I think towards the end of the series, where we'll talk about this phenomenon of the March and March movement in South Africa and so forth. But for now, I don't want to digress too much. Let me go to Proverbs, where I intended to read actually. Proverbs chapter 13, and I'm going to read verse 11. It says, wealth, on the same point as I've identified in Malachi. Proverbs 13, verse 11, wealth gained by dishonesty will be diminished, but he who gathers by labor will increase. Now, of course, you can labor and exert yourself and apply yourself and do your best quality-wise, in quantity, do everything that you ought to do in as far as working for the money that you have through business as a contractor or through employment, although it's unlawful, but you do work. So you are not being lazy, but the problem is that you are working against the law. It's an unlawful activity. And to the extent that God requires you to be compliant with the laws of the land, you actually are falling within the purview of Proverbs 13, verse 11, in as far as dishonest gain is concerned. Dishonest again, not in terms of microscopic theft, if I can use that phrase, for purposes of this episode, but in a broader sense, there is dishonesty, there is unfaithfulness when God requires you to comply with the law, but you don't comply with the law, and you benefit yourself from not complying with the law. And worse, now the church also becomes implicated because your non-compliance with the law, your unlawful proceeds, your proceeds of from unlawful activity is given to the church through tithe and offering, and the church becomes exposed to all kinds of legal consequences, one of which may be that the church itself is found guilty of an offense. When it comes to Proverbs 21, the same thing is said. 21, verse 6, it says, getting treasures by a lying tongue is the fleeting fantasy of those who seek death. Again, speaking about how, not just about whether you have income, but how have you acquired such income. Lastly, I want to read the book of James, chapter 5, talking to those who are rich. Of course, doesn't mean that if you're an unlawful foreigner, you are rich. Many of them, I think, they're not rich. They're just getting by, like many South Africans. But the principle, I think, is what's important here, not so much whether they are rich or not when it comes to this text. James 5, from verse 1 going down, come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted money is not corrupted in itself, but the corruption comes arises by the method or the how the money is acquired. That's what the corruption is, not the money itself, but how it has been acquired. And your garments are moth-eaten, your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. The verse continues, you have heaped up treasure in the last days. Now, verse 4, indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. Okay, so here it's dealing with, again, not just that you have income, and maybe it's a lot of income, you are rich, maybe you're not rich, but you have income, but you have acquired it unlawfully. So that conduct extends to the church and compromises the church, which may be found guilty of an offense, which may be fined up to 100 million rands. And of course, where individuals are concerned, it may also be a situation where the church elder or the church pastor or anybody in the church who is found to have violated the law, Section 5, Section 6 of the Act as we've looked at into now, they become compromised themselves and may be imprisoned for a period of up to 30 years. So this issue, therefore, of illegal immigration is not one to brush or to brush over and ignore and just say no. It's not important. We should love everybody, serve everybody, and just close one's eyes. You need to be very clear about the legal consequences. You might not have a church that you know of which has been found guilty in any of these ways, but you never know what the devil is setting you up for. And he might go along with you, things might be fine, and then one day he just sets you up and puts circumstances around you as a church that lead to you being investigated and being found as a church to have contravened the law. And here you go, you are now in the newspapers as a church that is harboring criminals in as far as immigration status is concerned, or perhaps is investigated for money laundering. You know, when those scandals come up, they really stay. And even if there is no money laundering, even if there is no gang activity or drugs involved, but the allegations themselves and the fact that you may be investigated for such can really lead the church to a state of disrepute. So therefore, friends, the church can be guilty of the crime. That if you go to Section 5 or Section 6, especially, in as far as proceeds of unlawful activities are concerned. Um, if I remember, no, it talks about the proceedings being civil proceedings, not criminal proceedings, but I don't have to go into that distinction for purposes of this episode. But at the end of the day, it is an offense if you are found to have violated the law, and the church should not be characterized and regarded as a church that doesn't comply with the law, but a church that respects the law, respects authorities. Of course, beyond authorities on earth, we respect the authority of the universe, God, who has given power to civil authorities, not to use as they please, as they want, but within the parameters of his will. And if there's a law that falls within the parameters of God's will, then you have to, as a Christian, comply and respect it. If you don't do so, well, you are not just violating the law of the land, but you are violating the law of God, and you find yourself at odds with the creator of the universe, and in contempt, not just of a court, but in contempt of God himself. May God bless you as you consider the implications of God's word. Amen.